Hey everybody, it's Tyler from CG Forge. In this video, we're going to cover Pyro and orientations to solve an issue with fast-moving objects. More specifically, we're going to zoom in on this problem right here. Whenever you have Pyro and you have a fast-moving object, you're going to get stepping. And you're also going to get an issue where the fire or the flame is not really moving along with the object properly. Now, before we get going, viewer discretion advised. This is more of an intermediate to advanced video. And so if you're new to Houdini, I'm going to be going really fast for the sake of time, and it might feel a little bit overwhelming. However, if you are new to Houdini, then I highly suggest that you visit Houdini Principles, because this course is going to unlock anything it is you're trying to do in Houdini. It's honestly pretty ideal for the beginner or even intermediate leveled artist, because we look at the principles that underlie every single effect, and by the end of the course, you'll have a toolkit to help you solve any problem. For more information, check out cgforge.com. Let's dive right into this fire issue and talk about how to solve the problems that we're seeing. So problem number one is that we have stepping. That is, if you're not familiar, these areas not being filled in properly. Now you might assume, all right, most of the time if you have stepping, the issue comes down to a lack of substeps, right? So you might add more substeps and think about these in-between spots. But if we have a sword here and it's moving fast enough, even at a substeps of 10 or 12 or something really high, it's still not going to be enough to capture fast-moving objects. And so not only that, but if you turn your substeps up to 10 or 12, your simulation times would go out of control. And so with a situation like this, we can't just turn up the substeps. We need to do something else to fix this stepping issue. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, and this is something that people don't always think about, is when we have our sword moving, that fire in the real world would experience wind resistance. And you can imagine that as it's flying through the air, we should see a shape that's being stretched out like this. Instead, we end up with little paint splatters, if you will, of fire. Fire spawns, there's no velocity that's pushing it based on the movement of the sword to sort of mimic that air resistance. And as a result, these aren't really behaving in a realistic way. So fast moving objects have a stepping issue, and it also has a velocity issue because it's not accounting for this wind resistance that would normally stretch a flame in a specific direction. So how we're going to solve this is by leveraging our understanding of orientations. Instead of simulating on a fast-moving sword, it's much easier to simulate on a frozen sword or a static sword, right? So imagine we take this sword, and let's just say that this is, the sword right here, right? That's not a dagger, but a sword, if you can imagine that. We need to take this at frame one, freeze the motion so it doesn't move, but then come up with some sort of velocity that's going to push the flames in different directions based on the movement of the animated sword. So again, we want to, number one, freeze the sword, and then number two, we want to apply velocity based on the movement. So based on movement. And then, last but not least, once the flame is moving around in a realistic way, we can then take our transforms and reapply them to the fire sim. So we could say reapply transforms or X-forms to fire. And then that will take our fire, you can imagine that, and place it back onto the animated sword. This is the round trip that we can do. And by doing this, it's going to take care of two of our problems. It's going to take care of the problem of the fire not reacting to the sword, and it's also going to take care of our stepping issue as well. If we dive into Houdini, this network seems a little bit complicated, but we can simplify this by saying that the first section here is going to create a particle simulation for rasterization. In other words, we freeze the sword and we have particles that spawn, which describe the movement that the fire needs to have. This becomes a velocity field that's rasterized down here. We also have density, we have burn, we have all of that being generated for the Pyro solver. We then simulate on the Pyro solver. And then lastly, we reapply the transforms to take that fire back onto the animated sword. And we also prep this for shading and rendering. That's the general outline here. And to get things started, I'm going to take our import node here, which brings in the animated sword, this blast node, which isolates the metal portion, and the trail node, which generates velocity. We're going to take this, bring it over here, and I'll show you how this works from scratch. So here we are with the animated sword. And when we go to the attributes, thus far, what I have is an emission mask for where the red hot areas are. I have this hot steel mask. This is going to be where the fire spawns. And we have normal, position, rest, and velocity. This right here is just basic attributes for the shader. And the only attribute we really need for our fire is in this hot steel mask. I'll go ahead and turn that on, and I'll turn off the textures so that we can see what this does. Essentially, as this goes forward, we can see that these areas turn red along the handle. And this is going to be responsible for spawning the fire. And we want to use that to spawn particles and direct the velocity. Okay, well, right away, pop network. If I take this into a pop net, we have this issue because the shop material path attribute is still there. So I'll get rid of that real quick. Attribute delete, and we'll go here and get rid of that material. Okay, so now we just have particles. Now, under the emission attribute, I'm going to use that hot steel mask right there. And we're just going to scatter onto surfaces. At first, it's going to be a lot of particles towards the end, and eventually it goes down the blade. And at first, too, it spawns everywhere because if this attribute is 0, it just spawns everywhere. That's all to say that we need to keyframe this birth. So I'll go here to the constant birth rate, and let's set this to a value of 0 on frame 3. And then we'll have this become fully fledged around frame 35, let's say. And for this, right now, let's just try 50,000 particles per second as we test this out. So here we go. There's our particles, and we can still see the stepping issue happening right here. Fortunately for us, when we have particle simulations, it's very easy to fix this stepping issue by going to the interpolate source option. We don't have point numbers that are changing, so because of that, we can set this to back. And now watch this. When it goes to spawn, we have a much smoother simulation going on. Now, when we get a really fast motion, we'll still notice that there's some substepping. We could see that happening here. See how that's all jagged? But now this issue is much easier to solve than it was before. So on our PopNet, let's say that we go to the simulation tab here, and I'm going to add 5 substeps to this pop sim. And now we have a much better arc. I don't want to work here at 5 substeps, so temporarily I'm going to turn this down. But in the future, I know that 5 substeps will fix this issue. So for now, just to keep things fast, I'll set that back down to 2. And now I need to start thinking about the movement of the fire. Remember, these particles are going to describe which way the fire is being pushed throughout the simulation. For one, I want the fire to experience air resistance or something along those lines. So right now, the trail stop here takes velocity, takes the direction that the sword is moving in. And it would be interesting to see what would happen if we were to invert that velocity. So that as the sword is going down this way, I have velocity going the opposite way. Perhaps by doing that, I can get that stretched out flame effect that we see when it encounters wind resistance. So to do that, it's very simple. I'll just take velocity and set it negative. Easy as that. Now, when the sword moves, we can see that this goes in the opposite direction. And again, that's going to really be nice when this goes to move, let's say, that way, because it's going to push the flame opposite to the direction of the sword, and it's going to stretch out that flame as a result. And to keep control of everything, I've multiplied this by a scaling vector here that just allows us to control how much of this effect we want in the future. All right, so that takes care of the movement of the sword, but we also want to take care of the upward movement that fire has. Normally that happens through the temperature field when you go to simulate Pyro, but remember, we're going to simulate on a static sword. And so as the sword is moving, let's say horizontally like this, let's say it's like that. When we have our static sword, the up direction that temperature wants to go in is not going to be in the right direction. To visualize that, let's say that I just take our sword here and I have this at frame 1. What I'm saying is that if I was to take our animated sword here, this would be the upwards direction. But if we were to simulate Pyro on the static sword, it would simulate this, which is going in the wrong direction. Hopefully that makes sense. But essentially put, that's all to say, we need to have an upwards velocity here on our particles that rasterize into velocity instead of a temperature field. So what we'll say is, on our old point wrangle here, we're just going to add in some sort of upward velocity. We'll just call this our upward vel. And for upward vel, I'm going to make a variable. So upward vel is equal to a new channel, and we're going to call this our temperature upward vel, or whatever you want to call that. So there's our temperature upwards velocity. Let's set that to a constant value of 5. And then if we'd like to add a bit of variety, we can then use the point velocity node and add just a little bit of curl noise to break things up. So for the first tab here, keep the incoming velocity, but then I want to take our velocity vectors, which are that right now, and I want to take a curl noise and just add a little bit to that. So we can go like that, take the swirl size down, and this will just add a bit of variation to our velocity. We don't want to go too crazy though, so just be careful about that. I just want to break this up like that. All right, so that's going to be our initial velocity on the spawn particles. And what I can do is also set down a pop drag. These particles should be moving fast, but then slow down fairly quickly as well, because a hot flame would be very fast at first and slow down quickly due to cold air. So now here's our particle simulation. It's going fairly quickly. We can see that right here, but it's looking pretty decent so far. Now let's adjust the life expectancy to maybe about 0.5, the variance of 0.25. And then last but not least, I'm going to set up this kill box so that if a particle goes outside of this box, it gets killed. So on the pop kill, I have the bounding option turned on. And then I've set this to a 4-meter box. For the center, I'll just go here to this extract centroid node, and I'll grab the center of mass here for our blade. Set this over to detail. So now we have 1 point, and then over on the pop net, right click, reference scene data, and we'll just go and grab that centroid right here. So on our points attributes, or the bounding box that is, we can just take the centroid of that and we'll just hit accept. And there we go. So now as this follows the moving sword, if a particle moves 4 meters away from the blade, it is going to get killed, just in case. Because we're rasterizing this as volumes, it's really important that we not overdo the amount of particles necessary, because otherwise it'll slow down our Pyro sim quite a bit. And actually, we can take this down as well. We'll try maybe a 3-meter box. There we go. Okay, so all of that is to say, now we have a particle sim. That particle sim is there to give us velocity for the Pyro sim. Now the question is, how do we take the orientation of these particles that are animated and get them to stick onto the static sword? Here we have the time shift. This is where we took our sword and made everything freeze at frame 1. Just to be safe, I'm going to uncheck this integer frames, just in case we want to look at subframes in the future. And, well, I'm going to have 2 versions of this. One is $FF. That is the animated sword. And over here is going to be the static. Let's name this as well. So anim sword, and we'll say this is our static sword. The node that's going to give us the transform information is the extract transform SOP. And for this, we need the reference and the target. So let's say that the target is our static and the reference is the anim. I forget which way is which, but if it's messed up, we'll fix it here later. Essentially what this does is it looks at the difference between the point positions and it creates a transform for the whole thing. So in this case, I want to create a transform matrix. By default, if we go to the Geo spreadsheet, this is going to create an attribute that is orient and pivots, which is good if you're trying to copy to points, but I find that stashing transforms as a detail attribute works better when you're just trying to orient things and SOPs just in general, but not necessarily instance. So for this, I'll go with the 4x4 transform matrix option. And then I also want to rename this attribute. So I'll say attribute rename. I like calling this attribute, instead of transform, xform. That's just my own personal preference. And then from here, attribute promotes. Let's turn this into a detail attribute. And we're turning that into a detail attribute because I want to store this once. I do not want to store this as many times as there are particles in our popnet. Like if I was just to take the point attribute here and put it on the particles, that would be lots and lots of data. We want to avoid that, so that's why we're using the detail context. Attribute copy, let's bring it over. So there she goes, and then for that xform. Now we go to the detail, and we have all of that transform information now on our particle sim. So there's the info. Now we just need to apply it to our particles. Keyword transform, and we want to transform by attribute. And just like that, xform is the default option. And as these particles move, guess what? That is going to now work on the static sword and move around as if it was animated. So this is what we're going to feed into our Pyro solver right here. I've set down this attribute delete as well as the group delete so that we're just left with point IDs and velocity. Now on the popnet, set this to a value of 5. And we also want to cache out substeps with this. So I'll set that to 5, but better yet, let's just make a relative reference just to be safe. Okay, so there we go. I'll cache this out, and then we'll briefly talk about rasterization and simulation. Okay, and as we can see here, after caching this out, we have our movement like this. I did adjust the birth rate to 300,000 particles per second, and I also turned down the life expectancy to 0.1 so that it's all just a bit more dialed in, essentially. But these are the volumes that we're going to rasterize for velocity. And then we'll take our hot steel mask and use that for the burn and density as well. When it comes to rasterization, everything is pretty straightforward. Here I have the velocity. That is turning into a volume right here. And then I bring in the sword, and this is the animated sword. I scatter some points, and on those scattered points is the hot steel mask. Now, the reason why I'm scattering here is because if we take a look at our sword, there aren't actually many points that make up this model. And so by scattering points, this allows us to have more detail in the sourced flame. So that's why it's better to scatter here as an example, because now I have all these points and I can get more detailed noise shapes if I want on that. But the only tricky part here is that we want this to exist on the static sword, right? We have this all existing here when the sword is static, and here is the animated sword. So the fix for that is quite simple. All we do is we take a copy of the animated sword like this, and then we just freeze this. We can use a time shift for that. Turn off integer frames, set that to 1, so that now, here's our static sword. And then before we scatter, all we need to do is copy the attributes. The reason why we need to copy attributes is because if we just kept our sword at frame 0, the hot steel attribute would not move because it would be frozen at frame 0, right? Or frame 1. So for that reason, we'll just copy over the hot steel mask right here. Hot steel underscore mask. And then let's double check that. So we'll go right there. And there we go. We can see that that mask is now working. And then once we have that mask, we can bring that over to the scatter. And then everything else can rasterize as normal. All right, let's cache that out. When it comes to the simulation, again, I'm not going to cover that for the sake of time, but if you don't know how to make fire, then check out Pyro 2. Everything gets cleaned up. I export the density as well as the flame field. That caches out, and when it's all said and done, if we do a play blast of the first 96 frames, or a flipbook that is, we'll see that the fire does move in the proper direction. Now, this Pyro simulation is not perfect. It might need some more shredding when things move fast, and you might want to take a few rounds to really dial everything in. But something like this is what we're after. Now, I want to point out that when things move quickly, we still see a little bit of this stepping happening with our flame. But once you add motion blur, that all blends together, and it's really not a big deal when it goes to render. So now the question is, how do we take our flame and put it back on the animated sword? Start by using an attribute copy, and we're going to find the transform that is a detail attribute up here. So this is all the way up here, right there, when we bring over this transform. We can just take that information and we can then do a transform by attribute again, but this time we just invert that transform. So when we invert that transform, and let's just make sure we're grabbing the right attribute there. So there's xform as a detail. There's xform. When we do that, and I'll set my visibility right here so we can see the fire, and we enable the sword, we can see that all of this now carries along with the sword, and we no longer have those stepping issues that we had before when this goes to move really fast. And then when we run a flipbook of that, we see this. And our stepping issues are gone. As a matter of fact, it's not just the stepping, but the fire now moves in a way that makes sense for the movement of the sword. And, well, we just took this simulation up like 5 notches. But the key to all of this, as you just saw, was an understanding of orientations, transforms, and Pyro just in general. So if this video was a little bit advanced for you, then definitely check out those courses. Also, if you're watching this on the day of release, tomorrow, that's going to be Wednesday, that's going to also include another video where I go over additional tips and tricks for fixing this stepping issue. There's one more thing I haven't shown you that's completely different than what we just did with the fire that can solve this issue. So if you're a subscriber at CG Forge, go to the resources tab at the top, go to tips and tricks, and very shortly you'll see another video that is going to explain all of that. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.